Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, and it is springtime in Washington. Actually, technically, it's almost after springtime in Washington. We've already hit the upper 80s and the cherry blossoms are gone, but it is still the only time of the year when the weather is nice in DC, so we will enjoy it. Lots of things to talk about today, lots going on. We are now entering the prime legislative season in Washington. Lots of little things going on and some big things going on behind the scenes. Before we get into that, anniversary of two very important events in the development of Western civilization. On this date in 1376, what became known as the Good Parliament opened in England. This is the parliament that began the process of the House of Commons kind of establishing supremacy within the government of England. At the end of this parliament, the House of Commons and Parliament more generally had established its authority to review the king's expenses, which eventually evolved into Parliament's authority over those expenses, which was an important event in the development of modern democracy. And today is when it got started. On what is probably a more important note, however, today is also the first official night baseball game in the United States, 1930 in Independence, Kansas. This is not the first night baseball game ever played, and it's not, which happened many years earlier, it's also not the first Major League Baseball game played, which was still a few years in the future. But this game was the first of a couple that were kind of tests by professional baseball, which didn't have a name yet, but it was the commissioner of baseball, to see if night games worked. They proved to be very popular. The players were able to actually, play. And so this particular game in Independence, Kansas in 1930 led fairly quickly to night games in Major League Baseball, except in Chicago, which took several decades to figure it out. So two very important events in Western history. Speaking of important events, the 2022 redistricting process is almost finished. And so we can kind of get a sense of what this is all going to mean for our upcoming elections. There are still 3 states that are drafting their lines, New Hampshire, Missouri, and New York. New York's lines were just thrown out the other day by the courts. So you'll notice the map that I'm showing you is actually out of date, but I couldn't find an updated one because New York should now be yellow because all their lines have been tossed. There is also a lawsuit in Kansas, which might cause their lines to be thrown out. Probably not, but it could. There are several states that are going to have to might have to redraw their lines. There are lawsuits proceeding in all of these states, but the lawsuits aren't going to be settled in time to use any new lines in 2022. Basically, the lines have to be in place a good distance before the primary date for them to work. And so once you hit the primary, and primaries start in May, you can't redraw the lines. So Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Ohio, and New Mexico may be redrawing their lines, but the lines they have now are set for 2022. Obviously, the important two there are Texas and Ohio, which have lots and lots of districts. And then there's Florida, where Governor DeSantis basically unilaterally drew the lines just in the last couple of weeks. Those lines have been adopted by the legislature. There will be lawsuits, however. Those really haven't gotten going yet, but because this just happened, the lawsuits haven't been filed, but they're going to be there. So there's still some uncertainty. However, if we look at the lines in the states that we know of, the number of strong districts have gone up 6 to 191. Now, the 191 number doesn't really matter because that's hard to calculate. What does matter is the districts that are leaning to the left have gone up by about 6. The number of districts that are leaning to the right have gone up about 11 to 164. That's based on the 2020 presidential election, which obviously Joe Biden won. And so it skews everything a little to the left. But what you can tell just even with those imprecise numbers is that legislators generally all across the country have chosen to solidify political advantage instead of trying to extract every last district theoretically possible out of their maps. Overall, the impact of redistricting, assuming the Florida maps hold, and assuming the New York map resorts to more or less what was there before, you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 5 seat advantage for the Republicans. Before Florida and with the old New York map, Democrats were plus maybe 2, a break even or plus 2. So we have a small shift in seats, probably, towards the Republicans just based on the redistricting, keeping in mind they need to pick up 5 seats to take the House of Representatives. So a shift of 3 to 5 seats, while tiny, is meaningful. On to policy. The America Competes Act is still probably going to be the big fight of the legislative year, other than the budget. Not much has happened since our last update because Congress was on recess almost the entire time. However, we're starting to see some behind the scenes stuff that tell us how this negotiation is going to go. Senate Republicans appear to be looking for a very small, or at least a relatively small bill. They want to essentially take the House bill and the Senate bill, drop everything that's different, and just keep the stuff that's the same, which is one way conference committees can go. In this case, that would mean the CHIPS Act and a few other little things that they put in there as well, but basically it'd become the CHIPS Act. Senate Democrats seem to be prioritizing, particularly Senator Schumer and the leadership, getting a deal. They know that they need at least 10 Republican votes to get this through the Senate, and so they're going to have to cut some deals. I don't think Senator Schumer is willing to go as small as the House Republicans are asking, but clearly he's willing to drop some big chunks of the bill to get something that can pass. House Democrats appear to be digging in their heels to defend at least most of the parts of the House Competes Act. The problem is the House Competes Act can't pass the Senate, so they're going to have to give on something if they want something to pass. And it's hard to tell if their kind of belligerent attitude that they're taking is their real position or it's just a negotiating position, which is, perfectly fine. House Republicans appear to be organizing to try to defeat the bill, to just undermine it any way they can. However, House Republicans are mostly irrelevant. Regardless of what the final, well, not regardless, but any reasonable version of competes to come out of conference committee will likely get at least a handful of Republican votes. And it's possible the Democrats don't need any Republican votes in the House. And so the House Republicans don't have a lot of leverage in this negotiation. Additionally, the Senate released its motions to instruct, which is this. Literally, this came out just about half an hour ago. Motion to instruct is when the Senate and the House creates a conference committee that requires a vote. It's a procedural thing. But as part of the vote, senators can give instructions to the conferees. They're not necessarily binding, but they try to obey them whenever they can. And so we have a list of instructions that the Senate is right now voting on, most of which are just messaging things. There's a lot about standing up to China and a lot on the Ukraine in here. Nothing that we get too terribly worked up about. A little bit on the energy sector. But as soon as this is done, and we expect that to be done today, the Senate will formally vote to start a conference committee. And then the formal negotiations will start probably on Tuesday next week when they get back. But this is moving. We expect the negotiations to take a while and to be hard, but we are still cautiously optimistic that the Competes Act will survive. Here's what we're worried about. Most of the Competes Act is popular enough to pass. If either the House bill or the Senate bill had moved to the floor of the two chambers, they probably would pass. The Senate version would definitely pass. The House version would probably pass. And so as long as a deal can be struck, then we're probably in business. And the deal will include the CHIPS Act and some of the other things that we like in there that we talked about last time. The problem we have, the big concern we have, is either a poison pill will be added, which it looks like some legislators are trying to do, or, and this is the bigger concern, that they won't be able to reach an agreement. Into this void comes a push from some groups here in Washington that we work with to add emergency supplemental appropriations language to the Competes Act. Here's the deal. In order to spend money, as you know, the federal agencies need an authorization, which is a law that gives them permission to spend money, and an appropriations, which actually gives them the money to spend. The Competes Act is predominantly an authorization bill. That is, it just gives permission, which is nice, but not sufficient. And so some groups have said, well, why don't we make it an appropriations bill too? We can open up the 2022 budget appropriations bills and add new money to them. This is called an emergency supplemental. It's done for things like the Ukraine funding. You know, when the 2022 budget was passed, we didn't know we had to give more money to the Ukraine. COVID money last year was done through an emergency supplemental. So these things do happen. The problem is this isn't an emergency. More on that in a minute. The CHIPS Act, it is worth noting, is an appropriations. It's an authorization bill, but it is also an appropriations bill. So there is precedent in the bill. Here's the problem. IEEE-USA supports funding the research provisions in the bill. The supplemental appropriations would be predominantly for NSF and NIST, the research agencies. And we support that. We think those things should be funded. However, trying to add it to the bill at this point would dramatically complicate negotiations because it's not in either bill, and conferees are not supposed to take new ideas and add them in conference. They can, but they're not supposed to, so it makes the negotiations harder. It could dramatically slow the negotiation process because the way this particular conference is set up is the leadership of particularly the House pulled members from every committee that had a piece of the Competes Act, which was most of them. But she didn't pick anybody from appropriations because Competes is not an appropriations bill. And apparently the conferees, the appropriators signed off on letting the CHIPS Act language get through. If a bunch of new appropriations money is added to the Competes Act, the Appropriations Committee would be within their rights to say, hold on, we want to take a look at that. And they could insist that the entire bill be moved through their committees before going to conference committee, which would likely kill the bill because we just run out of time. As I alluded to a moment ago, it's also very hard to justify this. I mean, FY 2022 is more than half over already. Best case scenario, the Competes Act wouldn't become law until June. Well, 2022 ends in October 1st. So why not do what IEEE-USA is asking Congress to do, which is put the appropriations language in the FY 2023 appropriations bills, which are just now being drafted, instead of complicating the negotiations by trying to get 2 or 3 extra months of funding. Doesn't seem worth the risk to us. This, however, is why this is coming up. You see this chart, which I've shown to you before from AAAS. These dotted lines here show what the Congress authorized for research spending. NSF, NIST, and the DOE Office of Science. The bright blue line is what they actually got. And as you can see, the authorization bills, which contained significant increases in funding, didn't actually result in much new funding. Research has been on a fairly steady increase over the last 20 years. And despite the Competes Acts and other authorization bills, it's still on that path. And so some groups said, well, let's take advantage of this Competes to not go down the same road, but to do both authorization and appropriations at the same time. Clever idea. It would work if we could do it, but I'd rather have the bill. And I don't want to put it at risk by trying to do this. President Biden, much to our enjoyment, appropriated or authorized $6 billion in new dollars to save distressed nuclear energy plants. Now, that's a position IEEE-USA has been advocating for quite a long time. The funding comes through last year's infrastructure bill, and we knew that there was language in there to support the nuclear energy industry. This is how $6 billion of it will be spent to kind of build support for America's nuclear energy industry. Different issue, but related. A couple European countries, particularly Bulgaria and Poland, are making noises about making nuclear energy their long-term response to Russia. In other words, they're looking to invest in nuclear power plants so they don't have to import energy from Russia. Obviously, that's not going to help them in the next 6 months, but long term, that would be a great idea. I mean, that's what France does. This seems to be part of a global reevaluation of nuclear, particularly from people on the left side of the political spectrum. Traditionally, the left has been the home of the environmentalists, who have had kind of a love-hate, but mostly hate approach towards nuclear energy. There is clear signs that the environmental left and the left more generally are starting to rethink their opposition to nuclear energy and are starting to decide that this is actually an important part of our nuclear portfolio, which is where IEEE-USA has been for quite some time. So we're glad they're catching up. But this is a good deal. It didn't get a lot of press attention, but this has the potential to be very impactful to the United States. So way to go, President Biden. Speaking of the administration, the Commerce Department has publicly said it supports Senator Klobuchar's American Innovation and Choice Online Act. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. This is a bill that prohibits companies from giving preferential access or treatment of any kind to their products on their platforms. So Apple can't prioritize Apple products and within Apple Marketplace. The bill, as we talked about, has good bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. What the DOC, Department of Commerce, has done is indicate that the administration supports this bill without the president actually saying it, which says they're kind of hedging their bets a little bit. But it's still a very strong statement of support. The Senate version of the bill moved out of committee in March. Unfortunately, the House bill moved out of committee last July and hasn't gone anywhere since then. IEEE-USA has weighed in to say that we don't think this bill raises any personal privacy concerns, which was one of the big arguments against it. However, I'm shifting my outlook on this particular bill from cautiously optimistic to cautiously pessimistic simply because of the timing. It's been sitting now for 6 weeks in the Senate and for nearly a year in the House, and we're running out of time. They're going to need to get working on it fairly soon if it's going to pass this year. The Senate has announced that they are starting bipartisan negotiations over a possible immigration bill. Nothing's done. There's no agreement. Nothing's on paper. But the things that they're talking about include legalizing dreamers. Those are people that entered the United States illegally as children. Maybe a new temporary visa program for restaurants. That's pretty scary. A streamlined processing for legal immigration, which we've been in favor of for quite some time, and enhanced border security of some sort. It is not clear at this point if high skill will be included. Remember, there is a high skill provision in Competes, at least the House version. It's starting to look like that's going to get dropped. If it does, it could very easily be picked up in this negotiation. But if it survives in Competes, there's no need to complicate this bill or whatever this becomes by adding it. So we'll see. Problem is, it's awfully late in the game for this sort of discussion. And the basic package of provisions, this kind of will legalize some of the folks that are here illegally in exchange for enhanced border security provisions. That basic structure of a deal between the two parties has been on the table for at least 15 years, and it never works. And it never works for exactly the same reason. Neither side really trusts each other. You can legalize all of the dreamers like that. Creating new border security provisions takes a lot longer. And so the Republicans don't want the legalization until the security's in place. Democrats don't want the security until the legalization takes, blah, blah, blah. So it's nice that they're talking, and we will monitor it and be helpful if we can. But we've been down this road before, and it's awfully late in a Congress to try to do this kind of stuff. One of two kind of internet regulation things that we need to talk about. California's net neutrality rules are moving forward. The California Internet Consumer Protection and Net Neutrality Act, which is a terrible acronym, bans blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization on the internet. That is, internet service providers can't prioritize certain types of traffic over others. Also bans access fees and bans zero rating. That's when ISPs allow users to access to some content without it counting against their minutes. Typically, that content is the ISP's content, or a company that owns the ISP's content, which the bill says, no, that's not right. The Ninth Circuit Court declined to issue an emergency injunction, so the laws will go into effect, although the case against the bill still continues, which actually is a little surprising to me. The legal issues here are actually quite interesting. The question is, how does one regulate online? Well, pretty much anything, because most laws are geographically based. More specifically, it's a debate over who gets to regulate online activity. The question is, can states do that? Since all online activity cuts across state borders, which would appear to violate the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. I actually expected the Ninth Circuit Court to give an emergency injunction on that exact grounds, that California's net neutrality rules will necessarily impact internet traffic that crosses state boundaries, and therefore California is trying to regulate interstate commerce. But they didn't, okay? But we'll see what the court case says, and this kind of case could, in theory, go to the Supreme Court. Second internet thing. Europe the EU specifically has passed a Digital Services Act, or the Digital Services Act, which says that media companies must police their online platforms to prevent illegal content. The law also prevents targeting ads using algorithms that are based on a user's gender, race, or religion. This is aimed squarely at kind of the big American social media companies, Meta, Google, Twitter, and others, although it'll affect everybody. Here's the problem with both the California law and the European law. The most logical place to regulate the internet is the United States Congress. Internet traffic is, of course, global, so it cuts all over state national boundaries. And if the most of the infrastructure, most of the companies, most of the servers and things are located in the United States, but they're splattered all over the place. So the best way to regulate these things is through the United States Congress, which has been entirely uninterested in doing that. In the absence of action by the United States Congress, states, particularly California, and now the EU, are stepping up to fill the void. The Digital Services Act will become the de facto global rule in the absence of an American law to act as a counterbalance. California or any of the states or any other country can come up with their own laws if they want, but because the EU is the biggest player in the game by far, they will have a disproportionate say in what actually ends up happening, much like GDPR has become the de facto privacy rule for most of the world's companies. And this highlights the danger in Congress not stepping up to the plate on these things and starting to pass some legislation. Because the United States has no law, we can't negotiate, we can't work with the Europeans, we can't find common ground. They just get to set the terms. And within the United States, because there's no national law, states can step up and do it themselves, which California is doing, and frankly is best place to do it because, it's California. Another decision, again, from the Ninth Circuit Court, which is the Western United States, found that web scraping is legal based on the, I think, entirely reasonable proposition that if you voluntarily put your personal information on a publicly accessible website, that information is public and people can grab it if they want to, which just is another reminder that if you don't want your information public, you shouldn't make it public. Good news from NSF. We have a new assistant director of the Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate of the NSF. The TIP Directorate was created in the appropriations bills last month, and Dr. Erwin Shandy, got to work on his name, who is a longtime NSF employee and, by the way, a computer scientist, which is awesome. He has a BA in computer science, an MA, and a PhD in bioengineering, all from the University of Virginia, which again tells us he's an amazing person. Says that this is a strong start to this new directorate. The challenge is that the directorate isn't really well defined. We don't really know what it's supposed to do. And so the new assistant director will be able to exercise a great deal of leadership in defining the new agency and figuring out what exactly it's supposed to do. IEEE-USA has already reached out to see if we can sit down with Dr. Jian Shandri to talk about what we think the directorate should do. Next update is Thursday, May 12th. We should be well into summer by then. It should be warm and toasty here in DC. And before I turn to comments, and if you have any comments and questions, please do add them to the comment section on your screen. I am Russell Harrison. I'm the Director of Government Relations with IEEE-USA in Washington, DC. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. If I or my staff can be helpful to you on any public policy matters that are of concern to you or the technology profession, please feel free to reach out. And with that, I will bop over to comments and see what we have. Okay. I do not see any comments, which is fine. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. If you think of anything you would like to talk about, feel free to give me a call. And until then, I hope you enjoy your spring wherever you are and whenever it arrives. And I look forward to talking with you again in 2 weeks. Have a good afternoon.
I had the coolest job that any electrical engineer could ever have on the ground crew for Solar Impulse 2, the first solar-powered airplane to fly around the world only using the power of the sun. IEEE-USA has given me a competitive edge because of their support system. It is so much easier doing something and being out of your comfort zone when you have someone there saying, you got this. IEEE-USA is more than just a network. It's a family.